Welcome to Fort Smith National Historic Site. We're starting off in the small museum that they have here. Fort Smith began, as far back as 1817. The first fort was built in 1822. One of the main reasons for building this fort was to enforce Indian policy. Oklahoma is just across the river, Arkansas River. About 1821, Fort Smith had a whopping 7 families living in town. Have some artifacts in here from when they've done archaeological research. This is Fort Smith in 1856. First courthouse was built, brick courthouse. By this time, about roughly 30 years after Fort Smith was first founded, population had grown to about 965 people. So there's the fort itself, and the town's getting just a little bit bigger. In 1964, the fort continues to be in place. This is during the Civil War. It was used to supply troops. There were some skirmishes here in the Civil War. Mainly it was held as a Confederate outpost, but really no major battles. By now the population's up to about 1,500. Fort pretty well remains the same, only now at this point it's manned by Confederate troops. And then following the Civil War, the courthouse becomes a federal courthouse seat. So the actual fortifications look like the courthouse is there. You can see we have a bridge crossing the Arkansas River now. Used to be a ferry, now there's a bridge, and the town is up to a little over 11,000 people. As I mentioned, Fort Smith sits right on the border of Oklahoma, which back in the early 1800s was considered Indian territory, and that's one of the reasons the fort was here, was to help maintain the law in that area. As Indians were moved along the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory from eastern parts of the United States, Fort Smith was one of the areas that they received supplies from. You can see here, get things, soaps, shoes, blankets, guns, all to help, quote, civilize the Native Americans. This stone here, very historic, 1858, it was actually a border marker on one side of the border. Take a look here, west, going east, north, and south. West would have been the border to the Indian Territory, east would have been Arkansas. We're now entering a recreation of one of the most famous judges in Arkansas, in particular in Fort Smith and in this courthouse. This is what the courtroom of Judge Isaac C. Parker would have looked like. Judge Parker served as a district judge here for the Western District of Arkansas from about 1872 to 1899 in this courtroom. He was one of the longest terming judges, and he's also known as the hanging judge. Based on the laws at the time for various crimes that required capital punishment, it said that he sentenced roughly 150 people to the gallows. And we'll see those gallows here in just a little bit.
Do equal and exact justice. Permit no innocent man to be punished, but let no guilty man escape. And let no politics enter here. Do this, and you will have done your duty as jurors of this court. Morning, Your Honor. Spectator crowds already gathered. Not much of rolls available. Our group is complete. I just finished composing some remarks for that jury we have today.
Good thing, too, Judge. This September heat's rapidly rising. Looking Indians are to do their duty. Woo! I think it's going to be a hot winter. But Judge Parker, the sooner we get rid of that...
This is Judge Parker.
Some of the jail, the better. Some of his dissatisfied former customers have been locked up with him too long. Tempers rising with the temperatures and all. We got to get him out of here before they send him someplace out.
Judge Parker was also, at one point, in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. And this is his desk and chair from 1871 to 1875.
Charged, introducing Laker to the Indian Territory. Guilty. He's been committed to jail here while waiting sentencing, Your Honor.
He was an express agent at Callister. Used his office as a means of getting whiskey to the jail.
I remember now. Very well. Mayor Winston, please bring him up for sentencing first thing in tomorrow's session. I'll credit him with time served against his sentence. At the Detroit House of Corrections, most likely.
Oh, thank you, Judge. And I'm sure he will, too.
Marshal, today we open what pretends to be a long trial, possibly over several sessions. How many suspects?
5, Your Honor. James Napier, John Morgan, Tom Cheatham, Lafayette Hudson, and Jeff Wilson, charged with larceny, Your Honor.
Oh, yes. I'll steal you, John.
This particular portion of the building also was the second jailhouse. We'll take a look at the first jailhouse here in a little bit. It's in the basement. But this display gives you an example of what the jail looked like inside the building. 2 inmates to a bed and a jailer. Also talk about some of the U.S. Marshals who were responsible for going out into Indian Territory or here in this part of Arkansas, tracking down criminals. Several famous criminals, including Ned Christie. It was a Winchester 44 and a Colt 44 that belonged to Ned Christie. Although she was never hanged, one of the more famous people to come through Judge Parker's court was Belle Starr, known as the Bandit Queen. It's a bracelet that Belle Starr owned. She was sentenced as a horse thief and spent time in the jail there.
I think it's like the thing.
Deputy U.S. Marshals, they were responsible for going out into Indian territory to track down criminals. That was a tough job. Over 100 of them in a period of about 20 years lost their lives chasing down outlaws, dangerous outlaws. They received very little money, but were needed for the courts to bring in criminals so that they could be punished. Not all marshals were white men. One of the most famous ones was Bass Reeves. He was a freed African American and probably one of the best law enforcement officers.
Judge Isaac C. Parker presiding. Having jurisdiction over Indian territory, courts cease all
Go down and take a look at the first jail cell, and then walk around the outside area. Upstairs, you saw what the jail cell looked like in its later years. Now we step into what's called hell on the border. This is what the jail cell looked like when the building first opened back in the early mid 1800s. 30 to 50 inmates would be kept in this dank, dark room. No ventilation. Obviously the windows were barred. This is where the guard would sit to keep an eye on the prisoners. No beds, just blankets tossed on the floor. This entire room that could have had 30 people, they had just a few plates, one cup, drinking barrel. No bathroom, just a couple buckets here for use as their restroom. Pretty depressing place. The new jail that they built upstairs that we saw an example of was much better. Let's head and take a look outside, what the building looks outside, and some of the other buildings. We'll continue on with our journey around Fort Smith. We're actually going to be looking at the second Fort Smith. And here in a little bit, we'll take a look at some of the original structures, or what's left of the original Fort Smith that was back in the about 1812. This particular second Fort Smith was constructed in 1838. And it was a fort till 1871. It was a part of a fort that ran all the way from Minnesota down to Louisiana to separate the territory that was occupied by the Native Americans and the American citizens. Native Americans would have been on the west. European or American citizens on the right.
Wishful thinking it was going to be nice and cool.
In the morning.
Well, security has always been a concern for the U.S. military. The Army did that.
This would be the parade ground. Flagpole. Big flagpole. Back in the Civil War, black infantry drilled on this parade ground that you see in front of you. At various times during the Civil War, Fort Smith housed 4 regiments of U.S. colored troops. One of those was organized locally. Drills increased after Confederate soldiers mercilessly massacred black troops who had surrendered at Poison Springs in 1864. Many of the troops were former slaves. After the Civil War, many of these black troops would actually be on duty in Indian territory. A few of them would become, like Bass Reeves, a U.S. Marshal. This was the courthouse building that we were in earlier. It's really two sections, very distinct sections you can make out. The first was over here ahead of us. That was the old courthouse. That was where Judge Parker's office would have been, courtroom would have been. And in the basement down there was that dank prison cell that we saw. This additional wing, which was built in the late 1800s, is where the newer jail cell was completed. Here's where the old jail cell was. A few windows. Back in the day, they wouldn't even have been glass. It would have been open, and it get pretty cold down here sometimes. In a day like today, very hot. And above that was the courtroom. In 1865, September of 1865, the Fort Smith Council was held in this building. To establish relations following the Civil War, delegates of 12 Indian nations met with representatives of President Andrew Johnson. Bitterly divided, Indians had fought for both sides of the war, but the United States now treated them as defeated enemies. Tribes were told their rights had been forfeited, their slaves must be free, and their property could be confiscated. That council in 1865 ended with little resolve. Not expecting to sign treaties and concerned that tribal sovereignty was at stake, the Indians simply pledged allegiance to the United States. A year later, in Washington, D.C., tribes signed separate treaties with the federal government. A lot of history's taken place inside that building. Off over here you can see the modern day Fort Smith. I actually have a video walking through downtown of Fort Smith. If you're interested in seeing that, just search for Wandering Walks Fort Smith. Here is a great example of a cannon. It was one of the most powerful and feared weapons used in the Civil War. Their ability to fire long distances ensured heavy enemy casualties. This type of cannon is known as a Napoleon, and it was used by both the North and the South. It allowed artillerymen to shoot a 12-pound cannonball at a distance of nearly a mile, and they were fairly accurate. It was one of the deadliest killing machines during the Civil War. For the unfortunate soldiers on the receiving end of the Napoleon, its loud, explosive boom meant terror and destruction. For many, it also meant they just had seconds to live. Back in 1872, what stood here, that no longer does, but it was a guardhouse. And in 1872, it became the women's jail. And here's an example of what it looked like. It remained used as a jail until 1888. Around that time, female prisoners were then housed in the main courthouse building. Back over here. Women were pretty well convicted of the same types of crimes that men were during that time. Selling whiskey to Indians in the Indian Territory, some with murder. And they received the same jail sentences, sometimes jail time, sometimes fines. Few were even hung. This building that you see down here was the original Frisco train depot. Before there were automobiles or airplanes, trains were probably about the best way to travel. They went about 65 miles per hour, and they could travel much further and faster than they could before. These trains would take people to popular destinations such as Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, various cities across the nation. This building here was the commissary. It was one of those city's most iconic landmarks, and it's actually the oldest building in Fort Smith. Its foundation was originally a raised platform from which to shoot cannons for defending the fort. In 1846, the building was converted for use to hold food, and it served many purposes over the years. It was a barracks for troops, federal court offices. At one point it was a private residence, and it was the city's first museum of history. As you can see, it was a commissary, stored food. There's soap, canned goods, probably flour. It's also used as a supply depot for the military. But it had an officer in charge of distributing food to the military, to citizens. It was also a place where Native Americans would come across from Indian Territory.
That looked like Mr. General Pat Claiborne right there. But it is.
it is too, but interesting. But Pat Claiborne did die around here, I think.
Now they're no longer here, but officers' quarters and barracks would have been in this area. And this is an example of what one of the gardens would have looked like. There's fruits, vegetables. Flowers. It's an old covered up well. And the outlines of where probably one of the barracks were. As I mentioned, this is one big flagstaff. The U.S. Army built the original flagstaff at the second Fort Smith in 1846. As with many Western military posts, the flagstaff stood so tall that its flag could be seen for many miles around. To attain a height of nearly 100 feet, the Army joined two poles in the same way that ships' masts were built. This is a replica that was rebuilt by the National Park Service in 1984. And although the wind's not blowing and it's hard to see, the flag is a 37-star flag that was flying when the fort closed in 1871. If you're ever interested in coming, there's the entrance to the visitor center, the bottom of the jail. We're now heading into probably one of the most infamous, probably more gruesome structures in Fort Smith Historic Park, National Historic Site. These are the gallows. During the 24 years that federal executions took place in Fort Smith, 87 men died on these gallows. While Judge Isaac C. Parker sat on the bench, 160 people, including 4 women, were sentenced to hang. Just over half received a reprieve from execution through pardons, commutations, reversals, or acquittals. or they simply just died in jail. Interesting, Judge Parker was not for the death penalty, but as a judge he had to follow the laws at that time. Here's a sketch of a Cherokee Bill being executed in 1896. Well, I hope you enjoyed your time at Fort Smith National Historic Site. Take one last quick look around. And we'll see you on the next walking tour. Take care.